Was it just a routine traffic stop or something far more sinister? Two corrupt cops thought they could humiliate and frame a black woman, thinking she'd be an easy target. But what they didn't realize was that they had just picked the wrong one. She wasn't just any woman. She was the one person who had the power to bring them down. What happens next? A ruthless battle of power, corruption, and cold, hard justice. And trust me, you won't believe how this ends. But before we dive in, tell us, what time is it where you are? And where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Birmingham, Alabama. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the quiet streets, bathing the city in a golden hue. The air was thick, heavy with the lingering heat of the day, and the distant hum of traffic filled the background. Talia Monroe rested her hands lightly on the steering wheel, her mind focused on getting home. Exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders, 10 long hours spent buried in reports, picking apart yet another case of police misconduct. Work that demanded patience, an iron will, and the ability to see through lies. And Talia? She was good at it, maybe too good. Just as she approached an intersection, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened, but her expression remained unreadable. Instinctively, she glanced at her dashboard. No speeding. No broken taillight. Nothing wrong. There was no real reason for this stop. But she knew better than to ignore it. Slowing down, she pulled over, keeping her hands visible on the wheel. In the mirror, she watched two officers step out of the patrol car. The taller one, built like a linebacker, moved with an air of authority. That had to be Carter. His reputation preceded him, an officer who loved power just a little too much. Behind him was a shorter, stockier man, following closely, Sullivan. The type who always played along to stay on the right side of the powerful. Carter strolled up to the driver's side, fingers lazily tapping on the roof of her car before leaning in. A smirk tugged at his lips, just enough to show the condescension in his tone. License and registration. Talia met his gaze, her voice calm. May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer? Carter barely made an effort to sound convincing. You ran a stop sign back there.
A lie.
She knew it. There was no stop sign at that intersection. Her grip on the wheel tightened for a brief moment before she let it go. That's not correct, she said evenly. Carter chuckled, shaking his head like she was amusing him. You sure about that? He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. Look, lady, you can argue all you want, but you're not talking your way out of this. Just hand over your license and registration. Sullivan took a step closer, his presence an unspoken warning. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Talia didn't react. She had seen this tactic before, the false confidence, the expectation that she'd be too intimidated to question them. Without a word, she reached into her glove compartment, pulled out her documents, and handed them over. Carter took his time looking at them. Then, as his eyes landed on her name, something flickered across his face. Recognition? But the smirk returned just as fast. Sullivan nudged Carter's shoulder. Let's check the trunk, he suggested, his voice tinged with anticipation. Talia's pulse stayed steady. But inside, she knew exactly where this was going. Do you have probable cause to search my vehicle? Her voice was firm, controlled. Carter gave an exaggerated shrug. Just a routine check, ma'am. Stay put. She had no choice but to watch as Sullivan moved to the back, flicking on his flashlight. Then, his voice rang out, triumphant. Well, look what we got here. Talia turned her head just enough to see him holding up a small plastic bag from her trunk. A bag that hadn't been there when she packed her car that morning. Cold realization settled over her. This was no random stop. This was a setup. Carter let out a whistle, stepping toward her. That's possession with intent to distribute, he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. Pretty serious charge. Sullivan smirked. Guess that makes things a lot more complicated, huh? Talia didn't flinch. She had been in far too many high-stakes situations to break under pressure. But she knew exactly what was happening. Step out of the vehicle, Carter ordered, reaching for his cuffs. Talia exhaled slowly, then complied. She pushed the door open, her movements deliberate, her face unreadable. Carter grabbed her wrist, twisting her arms behind her back as the cold click of handcuffs locked into place. He leaned in, breath hot against her ear. "Let's see how tough you are behind bars," he whispered, smirking. Talia turned her head slightly, locking eyes with him. No fear. No anger. Just certainty. "You're making a big mistake." For the first time, Carter hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but it was there. Something in her voice sent a chill down his spine. But he recovered quickly, yanking her forward. Sullivan laughed, already celebrating what he thought was a victory. What they didn't know was that they had just arrested the wrong woman. Monroe wasn't just another suspect. She was the hunter, and they were the prey. Sullivan chuckled nervously. "Come on, man. She's sitting in a damn cell. What could she possibly do?" Carter turned slowly, eyes dark with something Sullivan had never seen before. She already did it. Down in the holding cell, Talia sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. The station walls hummed with activity, officers moving back and forth, none realizing the storm brewing right under their noses. She had given Carter a chance to fix this. He hadn't taken it. Her phone call hadn't been to a lawyer. She didn't need one. It had been to someone much more dangerous. And now, the game had begun. Keller sat at his desk, staring at the name Daniel right on the paper in front of him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally took a deep breath and hit call. The line rang once.
Twice.
Then a voice answered, low, cautious. "Right speaking." Keller hesitated. "This is Officer Keller from the 3rd Precinct. I need to talk to you about Carter." A long pause. Then Wright exhaled sharply. "Took you long enough." Something in his tone made the hairs on Keller's neck stand up. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?"
Keller asked.
Wright gave a humorless chuckle. "Let's just say, I was waiting for someone in that damn department to wake up." Down in the holding cell, Talia Monroe smiled. She didn't need to see Carter's face to know the exact moment he realized the walls were closing in. It was always the same with men like him. The arrogance, the entitlement, the belief that they were untouchable. Until they weren't. She leaned her head back against the cold cement wall and closed her eyes. Any minute now. And then, as if on cue, the station's power flickered.
Once. Twice.
Then, the lights.